Of all the open wounds left on the Eurasian landmass following the collapse of the Soviet Union, Moldova remains one of the most understated, yet important, potential flashpoints. For 2 centuries, the nation considered to be among Europe's poorest has been gripped by a struggle between East and West. Or more precisely, Europe and Russia. Last week, Russian President Vladimir Putin threw more wood on this slow-burning fire. Russian media and several international outlets reported that Putin issued a decree fast-tracking citizenship for residents of the breakaway Russia-aligned region of Transnistria, a strip of strategically important land nestled between Moldova and Ukraine. The move has inflamed tensions that have been rising dramatically since the beginning of the year and prompted a tough response from Moldovan President Maia Sandu. Here's why Putin pulled this move, how Moldova and Sandu in particular have responded, and what these latest developments mean for the future of the region. The roots of the problem trace directly back to the collapse of the Soviet Union in the late 1980s. However, there's a case to be made that Moldova's problems with Russia stretch back to 1812, when Bessarabia, the eastern part of what was then known as Moldavia, was ceded to the Russian Empire at the conclusion of a war won by the Russians. The Moldovans, in the main, were never really settled under Russian rule. Historically and culturally, the majority of ethnic Moldovans are more aligned with neighboring Romania. Indeed, differences between the Moldovan and Romanian languages are, in a linguistic sense, mostly cosmetic. In 1918, in the aftermath of the Russian Revolution, Bessarabia briefly became independent as the Moldavian Democratic Republic and united with Romania. But sovereignty proved to be short-lived. During World War II, the Soviet Union occupied the territory and formed the Moldovan Soviet Socialist Republic. But when the Soviet Union started collapsing in 1989, the Moldovans seized the moment and moved towards independence again. And that's when the current troubles started. Transnistria, the roughly 1,600 square mile territory on the left bank of the Dniester River, opposed the surging Moldovan nationalism. Things got even hotter when the Moldovans passed a law enshrining Moldovan as the official language and replacing the Cyrillic alphabet with the Latin script. The majority of the population on the left bank primarily used Russian to communicate. So, ordinary Transnistrians, particularly those in the significant Russian and Ukrainian minorities, were perhaps legitimately worried about being sidelined under the new language regime and organized protests. More pertinently, Transnistria had become the industrial hub of Moldova under Soviet rule, and its elites had become increasingly powerful politically as a result. They could see the writing on the wall as power shifted westwards. When Moldova adopted a declaration of sovereignty in 1990, the Transnistrians declared themselves an autonomous republic, the Dniester Moldovan Autonomous Republic. A short civil war broke out, complicated by the involvement of the Soviet 14th Army, which had long been stationed in Transnistria. The Moldovans issued a decree that transferred all the former Soviet military troops and equipment to the emerging Moldovan Defense Forces. The 14th Army ignored it. Then, Russian President Boris Yeltsin transferred the forces under the control of the Russian Federation. The 14th Army then joined the side of the separatists, inflicting several key defeats on Moldovan forces that ensured the territorial integrity of the breakaway region. In the end, a peace accord was signed in July 1992, and negotiations to settle the conflict permanently began. Unfortunately, 34 years later, we seem to be as far away from a permanent, amicable settlement as ever. Various attempts have been made under the successive governments on both sides to reach a lasting peace and mutually acceptable territorial arrangements, but none have ultimately worked. Both sides blame the other for the failures. But crucially, Transnistria remains a region heavily dominated by Russia. Demographically, the region is divided roughly equally between ethnic Russians, Ukrainians, and Moldovans, with a sprinkling of Gagauz and Bulgarians. The region's official languages of Russian, Moldovan, and Ukrainian reflect this diversity. But Russian is the de facto primary language used in government, education, and daily life. More importantly, 1,500 soldiers of the operational group of Russian forces in Transnistria, or OGIF, remain permanently stationed in Transnistria. These troops used to be rotated every 6 months, but Moldova and Ukraine have been blocking Russian rotation attempts ever since 2022. Most of them are based at the decommissioned Soviet ammunition depot in the village of Kabasna. Situated just over a mile from the Ukrainian border, this massive weapons store is the largest in Eastern Europe, with around 22,000 tons of military equipment guarded by the Russian troops. As you can imagine, this huge stockpile of weapons is an open sore for both Moldova and Ukraine. No one besides the Transnistrian and Russian authorities really knows what's stored there or what kind of state it's in. Much of it is undoubtedly way past its sell-by date, having been there for anywhere from 35 to 75 years. And what's going on in Ukraine isn't helping things. With a highly destructive war taking place literally a few miles away, authorities fear the consequences of an accidental strike on the depot. With so much potentially dodgy ammunition stored there, the Academy of Sciences of Moldova determined in 2015 that an explosion at Kabasna would be equivalent to the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The Russians, Ukrainians, and Moldovans all also fear that the working ammunition and equipment stored there might be introduced into the war, potentially drawing Moldova into the conflict. It's a difficult problem to resolve with all concerned parties pulling in different directions. The Moldovans would like the arms and troops removed, but that's just not possible while the war in Ukraine is raging. The Transnistrian authorities seem to want to keep both as a kind of security guarantee against potential Moldovan attempts to reunify the region by force. The Ukrainians would, in all likelihood, love to kill the troops and seize the gear. And the Russians have long been trying to leverage the situation to their advantage, as the Russian leadership is prone to do. Now, for much of Moldova's post-independence period, the Transnistria issue was allowed to more or less slide. Moldovan governments tended to swing between pro-Russian and outright oligarch-controlled regimes, with neither having a strong incentive to close the chapter permanently. But all that changed decisively when Maia Sandu took office in 2020. Sandu is unequivocally not pro-Russian. She came to power on a pro-Western, anti-corruption platform, and has vigorously plotted a course towards EU and possibly even NATO integration. Moldova originally signed an association agreement with the European Union in 2014. But under Sandu's leadership, the quest for EU membership has had a rocket placed under it. In March 2022, Moldova applied for its EU membership and was officially granted candidate status 3 months later. In June of the following year, Moldova signed a comprehensive free trade agreement with the European Free Trade Association, with formal accession talks commencing in December of that year. A referendum on Moldova joining the EU was then held in 2024. Amidst widespread allegations of outside interference and vote manipulation by criminal groups, predominantly by Russian or Russian-aligned parties, a narrow 50.17% voted yes. With the green light secured from the populace, the work that needs to be done to meet the EU's strict admission criteria is in full swing. And the Transnistria issue presents one of the major stumbling blocks. We've seen this story before in Georgia and Ukraine. Now, Russia is using the same tactic to stymie, or at least delay indefinitely, Moldova's hopes of joining the EU. Here's how the strategy works. To meet the strict post-1993 Copenhagen criteria, Moldova must prove that it has a stable democracy, a functioning market economy, and the capacity to implement and uphold EU law throughout its territory. Like all former Soviet states, it inherited a decidedly non-market-based economy, mired in corruption. And like most of these states, oligarchs stepped into the gap left by the communists, entrenching and expanding the corruption, inequality, and lawlessness. It's no easy task overcoming these major structural issues as the poorest nation in Europe, even with much support from the EU and the United Nations Development Programme. Ukraine may have the dubious honor of having the lowest average wage in Europe, and North Macedonia, Montenegro, Andorra, and San Marino may have smaller GDPs. But in terms of the most significant measured GDP per capita on a purchasing power parity basis, i.e., the amount of GDP generated per person in local currency, Moldova ranks among the lowest in Europe overall. To meet the Copenhagen criteria, Ukraine still needs to deepen judicial reform, strengthen the rule of law, combat entrenched corruption, and complete de-oligarchization. No easy feat. The country also needs to align its legislation across all 35 negotiation chapters, enhance public administration, and ensure cybersecurity and energy independence. What's more, these measures need to be applied across the entire territory of the applicant country. And that's what makes the Transnistria issue the biggest impediment to Moldova's EU accession. You can't guarantee universal application of EU requirements across your territory when a strategically important chunk of it is de facto